The water in the main tank had been still for 3 hours when Marcus noticed something was wrong. Not wrong in the way alarms sound or machines fail, but wrong in the way silence becomes too heavy to carry. The whale had stopped moving. She floated near the surface, her massive body barely rising with each breath, her eye fixed on something beyond the glass, beyond the walls, beyond anything Marcus could name. He had worked at Crestwater Marine Park for 11 years. He had seen illness. He had seen refusal. He had seen death. But he had never seen a whale simply stop, as if she had finally decided that movement itself was no longer worth the effort. Before this story continues, subscribe to the channel and like this video. You won't understand why until the very end. Marcus arrived at Crestwater every morning at 5:45, before the sun painted the eastern sky, before the parking lot filled with minivans and tour buses, before the cheerful music started playing through the hidden speakers embedded in fake rocks and artificial palm trees. He liked those early hours. The park felt different when it was empty. The concrete pathways stretched out like grey rivers leading nowhere. The gift shops sat dark behind their locked glass doors, stuffed dolphins and plastic whale keychains hanging motionless in the display windows. The food court smelled of nothing yet. No popcorn, no fried dough, no sugary drinks spilling from oversized cups. In those hours, Crestwater was not a destination. It was just a place. A strange, quiet place filled with tanks and filters and the constant hum of machinery keeping everything alive. His routine never changed. He would clock in at the employee entrance, a plain grey door hidden behind a maintenance building that visitors never noticed. He would walk through the service tunnels, those long corridors that ran beneath the park like arteries, carrying staff and equipment and food for the animals. The tunnel smelled of chlorine and fish, a combination that had long stopped bothering him, a combination that had become the smell of his life. He would check the water quality reports left by the night crew, scanning the numbers for anything unusual, though unusual rarely happened. The systems at Crestwater were designed for consistency. Temperature, salinity, pH levels. Everything controlled, everything measured, everything kept within acceptable parameters. The animals lived inside those parameters. They had no choice. The main tank was called Neptune's Kingdom, though everyone on staff just called it the big tank. It held 6 million gallons of water, filtered and recirculated constantly, maintained at a precise 62 degrees. The tank was shaped like an irregular oval, designed to give the illusion of space, to make visitors believe they were seeing something vast and natural. There was an underwater viewing gallery with curved acrylic windows 12 inches thick, strong enough to withstand the pressure of all that water, all that weight. There were bleachers above, where crowds would gather for the daily shows, where trainers in wetsuits would stand on floating platforms and direct the animals through choreographed routines. There were hidden gates and medical pools and holding areas, the parts visitors never saw, the parts that made the visible parts possible. The whale in Neptune's Kingdom was named Orion. That was her official name. The name printed on the educational plaques, the name announced over the loudspeakers before every show. But Marcus had always called her something else in his mind. He called her the Quiet One. He had worked with other whales before, at Crestwater and at other facilities earlier in his career. He had seen whales that vocalized constantly, filling their tanks with clicks and calls. He had seen whales that swam in endless circles, their movements almost manic, as if they were trying to outrun something invisible. He had seen whales that performed eagerly, responding to every whistle and hand signal, accepting their fish rewards with what looked almost like enthusiasm. Orion was different. Orion moved slowly, deliberately, as if every motion required consideration. Orion rarely vocalized, and when she did, the sounds were low and short, more like sighs than calls. Orion performed her routines adequately, hitting her marks, completing her jumps, but there was something absent in her execution, something that made trainers uncomfortable even when they could not explain why. She had arrived at Crestwater 14 years ago, transported from a facility in another country that had closed due to financial difficulties. The records said she had been captured in northern waters when she was young, maybe 3 or 4 years old. The records said she had been healthy upon arrival, adapting well to her new environment. The records said she was an excellent candidate for public interaction programs. Marcus had read those records many times. He had noticed what they did not say. They did not say how the capture had happened. They did not say whether she had been with her family when she was taken. They did not say whether she had called out for them, whether she had tried to follow the boat, whether she had understood what was happening to her. The records were full of measurements and dates and veterinary notes. They were empty of everything else. That morning, the morning when everything began to change, Marcus completed his usual rounds before walking to the big tank. He checked the penguin enclosure, counting the birds as they waddled across their artificial eyes. He checked the sea lion pool, watching the animals bark at each other in their endless territorial disputes. He checked the touch tank where children could handle starfish and sea cucumbers, making sure the water level was correct and the animals appeared healthy. He checked the dolphin habitat, a smaller tank adjacent to Neptune's kingdom, where bottlenose dolphins swam in their own contained world. The dolphins seemed alert that morning, more active than usual, circling near the gate that connected their tank to the larger one. Marcus noted this in his log. Unusual behavior. Dolphins appear agitated. No obvious cause identified. When he reached the big tank, the sun was just beginning to rise, sending pale light through the skylights far above. The water surface was smooth, reflecting the light like a dark mirror. The bleachers were empty, the platform stowed away, the equipment locked in storage rooms. Marcus walked to the edge of the tank, to the low wall that separated staff areas from the water, and he looked down into the depths. At first, he could not see her. The tank was deep, over 40 feet in the center, and the bottom was painted a dark blue that made it hard to distinguish shapes in the shadows. Then she rose, slowly, her massive form emerging from the darkness like something from a dream. Her body was black and white, the patterns distinctive, unmistakable. Her dorsal fin, collapsed and bent from years of captivity, curved to one side like a question mark. Her pectoral fins spread wide, balancing her ascent. She broke the surface gently, her blowhole opening, releasing a breath that sounded like a quiet sigh, then taking another breath before sinking again, just below the surface, just enough to keep her eye above water. And that was when Marcus saw it. Her eye, fixed on something beyond the tank, beyond the walls of the facility, fixed on the east, where the sunrise was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She was not looking at him. She was not looking at the bleachers or the platforms or the gates. She was looking outside, at something she could not see, that somehow seemed to sense. The direction of the ocean, the direction of open water, the direction of a world she had not touched in 14 years. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, something uncomfortable and heavy, something he could not name. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she was just resting, just floating, just doing what whales do. But he did not move. He stood there, watching her watch something invisible, and he felt, for the first time in 11 years, that he was intruding on something private, something he had no right to witness. The park opened at 9. By then, the pathways had filled with visitors, families pushing strollers, teenagers taking pictures, elderly couples walking slowly with maps in their hands. The music had started playing, those cheerful melodies designed to create an atmosphere of fun and excitement. The food courts had opened, the smell of popcorn and fried food drifting through the air. The gift shops had unlocked their doors, staff arranging displays of stuffed animals and souvenir cups. Crestwater Marine Park had become what it was designed to be, a place of entertainment, a place of escape, a place where people came to forget the outside world and immerse themselves in something different. Marcus watched them from his position near the maintenance building. He watched families laughing, children pointing at the penguin exhibit, couples holding hands as they walked toward Neptune's kingdom. He watched them and wondered if any of them would notice what he had noticed, if any of them would see her stillness and understand what it meant. The first show of the day was scheduled for 11. Marcus was not a trainer. His job was maintenance and animal care, the behind-the-scenes work that kept the park functioning. He fed the animals, cleaned the tanks, monitored the equipment, assisted the veterinary staff when needed. He did not perform. He did not stand on platforms in front of crowds. He did not blow whistles or give hand signals or take bows when the audience applauded, but he always watched the shows. He had a spot near the service entrance, hidden from the audience but with a clear view of the water. He watched because he needed to see how the animals were doing. He watched because the shows revealed things that the daily routines did not. He watched because, after 11 years, he could not stop watching. The show began with music, dramatic and powerful, meant to create anticipation. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, welcoming guests to Neptune's kingdom, promising an unforgettable experience, an encounter with one of nature's most magnificent creatures. The trainers emerged on the platforms, waving to the crowd, smiling with practiced enthusiasm. The dolphins came first, leaping through hoops, spinning in the air, splashing the front rows to delighted screams. The sea lions followed, balancing balls, clapping their flippers, posing for photographs. The crowd applauded after every trick, their excitement genuine and uncomplicated. They had paid for this experience. They were receiving what they had paid for. The transaction was complete. Then came Orion. The music changed, becoming deeper, more orchestral, meant to convey majesty and awe. The announcer introduced her as the star of Crestwater, a magnificent creature who had called the park home for over a decade. The trainers took their positions on the central platform, buckets of fish ready, whistles hanging from their necks. Orion emerged from the holding area through the underwater gate, her massive body gliding into the main tank. The crowd gasped. No matter how many times people saw a whale, that first moment always produced the same reaction. Disbelief, wonder, a brief, overwhelming awareness of scale. She was enormous, 30 feet long, weighing close to 8,000 pounds. Her body filled the water, displaced it, dominated it. Against her, the trainers looked impossibly small, fragile, human. The routine began. Simple at first. Orion circling the tank, close to the surface, letting the audience see her full size. Then the commands. A hand signal, a whistle blow, and she would dive, then leap, her body rising from the water in an explosion of spray, twisting in the air before crashing back down. The crowd cheered. The trainers smiled. Another signal, another behavior. She would roll onto her back, exposing her white belly, her pectoral fins waving. She would open her mouth on command, letting the trainers pretend to count her teeth. She would accept fish from their hands, swallowing each reward before waiting for the next instruction. The routine was smooth, professional, rehearsed 1,000 times. To the audience, it looked like magic. To Marcus, it looked like something else entirely. He noticed the delay. It was small, almost imperceptible, probably invisible to anyone who did not know her. But Marcus knew her. He had watched her perform for 11 years. He knew her timing, her rhythms, the way she responded to each command. And today, there was a delay, a fraction of a second between the whistle and her movement. A hesitation where there had never been hesitation before. She still completed every behavior. She still hit every mark. But something was different. Something had shifted. Marcus felt that weight in his chest again, that uncomfortable heaviness, and he gripped the railing in front of him, his knuckles turning white, his jaw tight. He did not know what he was watching. He only knew that he could not look away. After the show, he found himself walking toward the underwater viewing gallery. This was not part of his routine. His work took him elsewhere, to the food preparation area, to the filtration systems, to the maintenance logs that needed updating. But his feet carried him down the sloping corridor, past the educational displays about marine life, past the interactive screens where children could learn facts about whales and dolphins, past the gift shop selling its endless merchandise. He reached the gallery and stopped. The space was dark, lit only by the blue glow from the tank. The acrylic windows curved around him, offering a panoramic view into Neptune's kingdom. Visitors stood in small groups, pointing, whispering, taking pictures. Children pressed their faces against the glass, their breath fogging the surface. And beyond the glass, in the water, Orion floated. She was near the window, closer than she usually came. Her body hung vertically. Her tail pointed down, her head near the surface, her eye level with the humans watching her. Marcus moved through the crowd until he stood directly in front of her. The glass was thick between them, 12 inches of acrylic that could withstand tremendous pressure, that separated two worlds completely. He placed his hand against it. The surface was cool, smooth, slightly curved. She did not move. She hung in the water, motionless except for the slight adjustments of her fins keeping her in place. And she looked at him, not past him, not through him, at him. Her eye was dark, deep, impossibly complex. It held something Marcus could not understand. It held years. It held memory. It held an awareness that made him want to step back and run, or step forward and never leave. A child's voice broke the silence. The little girl standing next to Marcus tugged at her mother's hand and asked why the whale was so sad. The mother laughed nervously and said the whale was not sad. The whale was just resting. The whale had a wonderful life here with people taking care of her. The child did not seem convinced. She kept looking at Orion, her small face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with something that was not wonder, something closer to concern. Marcus wanted to tell her something. He did not know what. He wanted to explain something that he himself did not understand. Instead, he turned and walked away, back through the gallery, back up the corridor, back into the sunlight that suddenly felt too bright and too warm. The days that followed were ordinary on the surface, The park opened and closed. The shows continued. The visitors came and went. The animals performed their routines, ate their meals, swam their endless circuits through their tanks. Marcus worked his shifts, completed his tasks, filed his reports. Nothing visible had changed. But beneath the surface, in those spaces where records and measurements could not reach, everything had shifted. Marcus found himself watching Orion more than he ever had before. He would arrive earlier, before the rest of the staff, and stand by the big tank in the darkness before dawn. He would stay later, after the park had closed, and watch her through the underwater gallery when it was empty and silent. He was looking for something. He did not know what. He only knew that her stillness had become a question he could not stop asking. She had begun spending more time near the eastern wall. This was the wall closest to the ocean, though the ocean was miles away, invisible behind buildings and highways and stretches of urban development. There was no way she could see the ocean. There was no way she could smell it or hear it or sense it through the concrete and steel and glass that surrounded her. Yet she lingered there, near that wall, facing east, floating in a position that looked almost like waiting. Marcus began keeping notes. Not official logs, but personal observations, scribbled in a small notebook he kept in his locker. Eastern wall, 6:47 a.m. Stationary for 40 minutes. No vocalization. Respiration slow. The notes accumulated, page after page. A record of stillness that seemed to tell a story he could not quite read. The other animals noticed too. The dolphins in the adjacent tank had grown more vocal, their clicks and whistles increasing in frequency whenever Orion approached the connecting gate. They would gather near the barrier, their movements quick and nervous, as if they were trying to communicate something urgent. The sea lions in their pool would sometimes stop their barking and turn toward Neptune's kingdom, their dark eyes fixed on something humans could not perceive. Even the penguins in their distant enclosure seemed affected, their usual bustling activity replaced by periods of unusual stillness. Marcus mentioned these observations to the senior veterinarian during a routine meeting. The vet nodded, made a note, said he would review the behavioral data. Nothing in his tone suggested concern. Nothing in his manner suggested that anything unusual was happening. The parameters were all within acceptable ranges. The animals were all considered healthy. There was nothing in the numbers that warranted intervention. But Marcus could not stop watching. He could not stop thinking about her eye, that dark depth that seemed to hold more than an animal should be able to hold. He found himself researching at night, reading articles and studies on his laptop in his small apartment, learning things he had somehow never learned in his years of working with marine mammals. He read about their intelligence, their complex social structures, their ability to communicate across vast distances. He read about their lifespans in the wild, decades longer than in captivity. He read about their migrations, thousands of miles through open ocean, journeys that took them across the entire world. He read about their families, the bonds between mothers and calves, the connections that lasted a lifetime. He read, and each new piece of information made the weight in his chest grow heavier, made the silence between him and Orion feel more unbearable. 3 weeks after that first morning, something happened. Marcus was in the underwater gallery, alone, watching Orion through the acrylic window. It was late evening, almost closing time, and the gallery was empty. The blue light filled the space, casting shadows that moved like water. She was near the glass again, in that vertical floating position, her eye visible, her body still. Marcus stood where he always stood, his hand against the window, watching her watch him. And then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she brought her pectoral fin up toward the glass. It was a small movement, almost hesitant, as if she was not sure she should be doing it. Her fin touched the acrylic, just for a moment, right where his hand was pressed on the other side. Then she pulled back, returned to her stillness, and continued watching him with that dark, complex eye. Marcus did not move. He could not move. His hand remained pressed against the glass, shaking slightly. His breath caught somewhere in his throat. He did not know what had just happened. He did not know if it meant anything. He only knew that something had passed between them, something silent and strange and irreversible. He stood there until a security guard came to tell him the park was closing, and even then, he could barely force his legs to carry him away. The next morning, he requested a meeting with the park director. This was unusual. Marcus had never requested such a meeting before. In 11 years, he had spoken to the director perhaps a dozen times, always in group settings, always about operational matters. He did not know what he was going to say. He had not prepared a speech or a proposal. He only knew that he could not continue as he had been continuing. Something had to change. Something had to be said. He owed her that much, even if he did not understand why. The director's office was on the second floor of the administration building, overlooking the main entrance of the park. The room was decorated with photographs of Crestwater's history, images of smiling families, performing animals, grand openings and anniversaries. There were awards on the shelves, plaques recognizing the park's contributions to education and conservation. There was a large window that looked out over the pathways and exhibits, a view that showed the park as it was meant to be seen, as a place of joy and wonder. The director was a woman named Catherine Mills, professional and efficient, always dressed impeccably, always speaking in measured tones. She had been with Crestwater for 20 years, longer than Marcus. She knew the park better than anyone. She also knew what it took to keep the park running, to keep the visitors coming, to keep the revenue flowing. These were realities that could not be ignored. Marcus sat across from her desk and tried to find words. He talked about Orion's behavior, her stillness, her time near the eastern wall. He talked about the delay in her responses during shows, so small that audiences could not see it, but so significant that it worried him. He talked about her eye, about the way she looked at him through the glass, about the moment when her fin had touched the window. He knew how he sounded. He knew that what he was saying could not be measured, could not be recorded, could not be translated into the language of reports and parameters. He knew that Catherine was listening politely, but that her mind was calculating, assessing, determining how to respond to an employee who seemed to be having some kind of emotional episode. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice calm and professional. She appreciated his dedication to the animals. She valued his years of service. She understood that working closely with marine mammals could create strong emotional connections. But she needed to remind him that Orion was receiving excellent care. The veterinary team monitored her constantly. Her diet was carefully managed. Her environment was designed to meet her needs. There was no evidence of illness or distress in any of the objective measures. What Marcus was describing sounded like anthropomorphism, the tendency to attribute human emotions and motivations to animals. It was a common phenomenon among caretakers, and it was understandable. But it was not a basis for operational decisions. The park had responsibilities to its visitors, to its staff, to its financial stakeholders. They could not make changes based on feelings. Marcus listened. He nodded. He thanked her for her time. He walked back to the maintenance building, changed into his work clothes, and began his shift. He told himself that she was probably right. He told himself that he was probably projecting, probably imagining, probably letting loneliness and routine create meanings that were not really there. He told himself these things, and he did not believe any of them. That night, alone in his apartment, he made a decision. He did not know where it would lead or what it would cost. He only knew that he could not unsee what he had seen. He could not unfeel what he had felt. Something had changed, and there was no going back. Over the following months, Marcus began to change his behavior at the park. He started spending more time with Orion, not as a spectator but as a presence. He would sit by the tank in the early mornings, before anyone else arrived, just being there, just letting her know that someone was there. He would talk to her quietly, knowing she could not understand his words, but hoping that she could understand something else. Something beneath the words, something in the tone and rhythm of his voice. He told her about his life, about the choices that had led him here, about the things he regretted and the things he hoped for. He told her that he was sorry. He did not specify what he was sorry for. He was not sure himself. He just knew that he needed to say it. She began to respond. Not dramatically. Not in ways that anyone else would notice, but in small shifts that Marcus could see, because he was watching so closely. She would come to the surface when he arrived, her blowhole opening to take breath after breath, as if she was greeting him. She would float near wherever he stood, adjusting her position as he moved around the tank. She would touch her fin to the glass when he was in the gallery, that same hesitant gesture she had made that first time, as if she was reaching for something she knew she could not have. The other staff noticed that Orion seemed calmer, more cooperative during shows, more engaged during training sessions. They credited the new enrichment protocols the veterinary team had implemented. They did not know about the hours Marcus spent by her tank, about the conversations she could not understand, about the connection that was forming in the silence. Spring arrived, and with it a busy season. The park filled with visitors. The shows increased in frequency. The demands on staff grew heavier. Marcus worked longer hours, his body tired, but his mind strangely alert, focused on Orion in a way that made everything else seem distant and unimportant. He began to notice things about the other animals too. The dolphins in the adjacent tank seemed to have formed a closer bond, swimming in tighter formations, vocalizing more frequently, as if they were creating their own society within the walls of their captivity. The sea lions had developed new behaviors, games they played with each other when no one was watching, competitions for the best spots on the rocks, alliances and rivalries that played out in barks and postures. The penguins had begun to recognize certain staff members, responding differently to different approaches, showing preferences and aversions that went beyond simple conditioning. The animals were not just surviving, they were adapting, creating, finding ways to be themselves within the constraints imposed upon them. This realization did not make Marcus feel better. It made him feel worse. Summer brought the peak crowds, the longest lines, the hottest days. The water in Neptune's kingdom was kept at a constant temperature, but the air above the tank grew warm and humid, and the animals seemed sluggish in the heat. Orion's behaviors during shows became less precise, her timing slipping, her movements lacking the energy that audiences expected. The trainers compensated, adjusting their routines, adding extra reinforcement, but there was a growing concern among the performance staff that something was changing. Marcus heard the conversations in break rooms and hallways. People were worried. People were frustrated. People were looking for explanations that fit within their understanding of how things worked. The veterinary team conducted additional examinations, blood tests, ultrasounds, behavioral assessments. Everything came back within normal parameters. Orion was healthy, they concluded. She was simply aging. She was 28 years old, past middle age for a whale in captivity. Some decline in performance was to be expected. Some reduction in energy was natural. There was no cause for alarm. The park would adjust its expectations and continue as planned. Marcus read the veterinary reports and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew what aging meant for a whale like Orion. He knew the statistics, the studies, the comparisons between captive and wild lifespans. In the wild, whales like her could live 50, 60, even 70 years or more. They could spend decades traveling with their families, raising their young, communicating across miles of open ocean. In captivity, they rarely reached 35. Their bodies wore out faster. Their spirits wore out faster. The tank that had been their whole world became too small to contain what they were becoming, and eventually, they simply stopped. Marcus had seen it before. He had told himself it was natural. It was normal. It was just how things were. He did not tell himself that anymore. Autumn came, and with it a change in the weather. The skies grew grey. The winds grew cold. The crowds thinned as the tourist season ended. Crestwater entered its quieter period, the time when maintenance projects were scheduled, when staff took vacations, when the park took a breath before the cycle began again. Marcus used this time to be with Orion more than ever. He was there every morning, every evening, and often during the slow afternoons when the galleries were empty and the shows were sparse. He watched her. He talked to her. He pressed his hand against the glass and waited for her to press her fin against the other side. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she did not. Either way, he stayed. One evening in late October, Marcus was in the underwater gallery when he noticed something different. Orion was not in her usual position. She was not near the eastern wall. She was not floating vertically by the glass. She was at the bottom of the tank, in the deepest part, resting on the dark blue floor. Her body was still. Her eyes were open. She was not moving at all. Marcus felt his heart stop. He pressed himself against the glass, trying to see better, trying to determine if she was breathing, if she was alive, if everything had ended while he was standing there watching. Long seconds passed. Then, slowly, she rose. She pushed off the bottom with a gentle movement of her tail and began to ascend, her body tilting upward, her form growing larger as she approached the surface. She broke through with a breath that sounded different than usual, deeper and longer, as if she was pulling air from somewhere far away. Then she sank again, returning to the bottom, to that same position, to that same stillness. Marcus did not know what he was seeing. He did not know if it was significant or meaningless, if it was a new behavior or something she had always done when no one was watching. He only knew that it scared him. He only knew that the weight in his chest had become almost unbearable, pressing down on him with a force that made it hard to breathe. He left the gallery and walked to his locker, where he retrieved his notebook and added a new entry. Bottom of tank, 7:23 p.m. stationary for extended period. appeared to be resting on floor, rose slowly, breath deep and prolonged, returned to bottom. He looked at the words and they seemed inadequate, incapable of capturing what he had witnessed, what he had felt. But he wrote them anyway. He had nothing else. November arrived, and with it news that changed everything. Catherine Mills called an all-staff meeting and announced that Crestwater Marine Park had been sold. The new owners were a corporation with interests in real estate development. They had plans to transform the property into something different, something more profitable, something that did not include marine animals. The park would close at the end of the year. The animals would be transferred to other facilities that could accommodate them. The staff would receive severance packages and assistance finding new employment. Catherine spoke in that same calm, professional tone, but there was something beneath it, a tremor that suggested even she was not prepared for this ending. The weeks that followed were chaos. Staff members scrambled to find new jobs. Departments coordinated the massive logistics of shutting down a facility that had operated for decades. Veterinarians worked to prepare the animals for transport, assessing their health, coordinating with receiving facilities, managing the stress of change. Visitors flooded the park, eager to see the animals one last time, to take photographs, to say goodbye to a place that had been part of their lives. The gift shops sold out of merchandise. The food courts ran out of supplies. The pathways were crowded every day, from opening to close, with people who wanted to witness the end of something they had thought would last forever. Marcus worked harder than he ever had. There was so much to do, so many tasks that needed completing, so many details that could not be overlooked. But in the midst of it all, he kept returning to Neptune's kingdom. He kept standing by the tank in the early mornings and late evenings. He kept talking to Orion, telling her that things were changing, that she would be leaving, that he did not know where she would go or what would happen to her. He did not know if she understood. He did not know if understanding was even possible between them. He only knew that he needed to say these things, needed to prepare her somehow, needed to not let her be surprised by whatever came next. The plan for Orion was complicated. She was too large for most facilities. Her health, while stable, was not optimal. The options were limited. There was talk of a sanctuary, a sea pen operation in a northern bay where whales could live in more natural conditions, but the logistics were challenging and the funding was uncertain. There was talk of another park, one with the capacity to house her, but the distance was great and the transport risky. There was talk quietly among the veterinary staff that perhaps the kindest option was not transport at all, that perhaps letting her go peacefully would be better than subjecting her to more upheaval, more change, more of a life that had never really been hers. Marcus heard this talk and felt rage, then despair, then a numbness that settled over him like a blanket. December arrived, and with it the final days. The park's closing was scheduled for the 31st, a New Year's Eve farewell that had been promoted heavily, that promised crowds and celebrations and one last chance to experience the magic of Crestwater. Marcus avoided the promotional events, the media interviews, the forced cheer of management trying to end things on a positive note. He spent his days with the animals, making sure their final weeks at Crestwater were as comfortable as possible, making sure they did not sense the anxiety that everyone else was feeling. He spent his nights with Orion, standing by her tank in the darkness, watching her float in the blue glow, wondering what she knew, what she felt, what she would remember after this was over. On Christmas morning, Marcus arrived at the park before anyone else. The facility was closed for the holiday, and the grounds were empty, silent, covered in a thin layer of frost that sparkled in the early light. He let himself in through the employee entrance and walked to Neptune's kingdom. The tank was still, the water unmoving, the machinery humming its constant song. He stood at the edge and looked down into the depths. Orion was there, floating near the eastern wall, in that position she had held so many times, facing towards something she could not see. Marcus climbed over the low barrier and sat on the ledge, his feet dangling toward the water. He had never done this before. It was against every rule and protocol, but the rules did not seem to matter anymore. Nothing seemed to matter except this moment, this connection, this goodbye. He talked to her. He told her about his life before Crestwater, about the dreams he had once had, about the compromises he had made along the way. He told her about his loneliness, about the relationships that had failed, about the sense that he had been waiting for something without knowing what it was. He told her that meeting her, really meeting her, had changed something in him, had awakened something that he had thought was dead. He told her that he did not know what would happen next, but that he hoped, with everything in him, that she would find something better than this, that she would swim in open water again, that she would hear voices of her own kind again, that she would be free, if not in body, then in some way that mattered. She rose while he was speaking. She rose from the depths and approached the surface near where he sat. Her eye broke the water first, then her head, then the curve of her back. She was close, so close that he could have reached out and touched her. He did not touch her. He sat very still, barely breathing, watching her watch him. And in that moment, something passed between them. Something that could not be measured or recorded or explained. Something that was older than language, older than captivity, older than the walls and tanks and systems that had defined their lives. It was recognition. It was understanding. It was a kind of love that had no name. On New Year's Eve, Crestwater Marine Park held its final show. The bleachers were packed, every seat filled. People standing in the aisles and crowding the walkways. The music played, louder than usual, more dramatic. The trainers performed with extra energy, knowing that this was their last time, that after tonight, everything would change. The dolphins leaped higher. The sea lions barked louder. The crowd cheered with a desperation that sounded almost like grief. And then it was time for Orion. She entered the main tank slowly, her body moving through the water with that deliberate grace Marcus knew so well. She circled the tank once, letting everyone see her, letting them take their photographs and shed their tears. Then she began her routine. Every behavior, every jump, every roll and wave and slide across the surface. She performed it all, flawlessly, with a precision she had not shown in months. The crowd was standing, cheering, crying, calling her name. The trainers were wiping tears from their eyes as they gave their signals. The moment was everything Crestwater had ever promised, everything the park had ever been, distilled into these final minutes of choreographed wonder. And then, at the end, she did something unexpected. Instead of returning to the holding area through the underwater gate, she swam to the eastern wall. She pressed her body against it, that massive form flattening against the concrete, her eye visible above the water, looking east. She stayed there for a long moment, ignoring the whistles and signals from the trainers, ignoring the confused murmurs from the crowd. She stayed there, looking at something no one else could see, and the park went silent. The music stopped, the cheering stopped, everything stopped. And in that silence, something broke. Marcus was in the audience. He had not planned to be there, had not wanted to watch the final show, but something had drawn him to the bleachers, something he could not resist. He was crying. Everyone around him was crying, but his tears were different. His tears came from a place so deep that he had not known it existed until now. He watched her press herself against the wall, and he understood. She was saying goodbye, not to the park, not to the trainers, not to the life she had lived here. She was saying goodbye to something else, to the dream of open water, to the hope that had never quite died, to the part of herself that had been waiting, all these years, for a return that would never come. The next day, the park was closed. The gates were locked, the signs were taken down, the parking lot was empty. The transfer teams arrived to begin the process of relocating the animals. The dolphins went first, loaded into specialized transports, their clicks and whistles fading as the trucks drove away. The sea lions followed, then the penguins, then the smaller fish and invertebrates that had filled the touch tanks and display aquariums. One by one, the inhabitants of Crestwater left, until only Orion remained. Her transfer was scheduled for the following week. The sanctuary had secured funding. The sea pen was ready. The transport team was experienced and careful. Everything was in place for her to leave this tank for the last time and begin a new chapter, in water that was real, in a space that was larger, in a world that was closer to what she had lost so long ago. Marcus was assigned to assist with the preparation. He worked around the clock, checking equipment, reviewing procedures, making sure every detail was perfect. He would not let anything go wrong. He would not let this opportunity slip away. The day of the transport arrived. It was cold, the sky grey and heavy with clouds that promised snow. The team gathered around Neptune's kingdom, equipment ready, the specialized transport tank waiting on a truck in the service area. They would need to lower the water level, guide Orion into a stretcher system, lift her carefully from the tank, and transfer her to the transport container that would carry her to the coast. The process would take hours. It would be stressful and risky, but every precaution had been taken. This was going to work. It had to work. Marcus was in the water. He had volunteered to be part of the team that would guide Orion into the stretcher. He wore a wetsuit, his body submerged in the cold water that had been her world for 14 years. She was nearby, watching the preparations, her movements slow and uncertain. She knew something was happening. She could feel the change in her environment, the lowering water level, the presence of people and equipment that had never been there before. Marcus swam toward her, slowly, carefully, his hand extended. He spoke to her, his voice muffled by the water, but still reaching her. He told her that it was okay, that this was the end of one thing and the beginning of another, that she was going somewhere better, somewhere she could be more than what this tank had allowed her to be. She looked at him, that same deep, complex eye that had changed everything. And then, slowly, she moved toward the stretcher. She allowed herself to be guided, allowed the team to position her, allowed the straps to be secured around her body. She did not struggle. She did not resist. She trusted. And that trust, that fragile, impossible trust, was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing Marcus had ever witnessed. The lift was smooth. The transfer was flawless. The transport tank was sealed. The truck began its journey, and Marcus stood by the empty pool, watching until the vehicle disappeared around the corner. The park was silent now. Neptune's kingdom was just a hole in the ground, filled with equipment and puddles and the echo of something that was gone. Marcus stayed there for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just being present in the space where she had been, letting the emptiness fill him. Months later, he received a letter from the sanctuary. They had included a photograph. Orion in a sea pen, her dorsal fin still bent, her body still marked by the years of captivity, but swimming in water that moved with tides and currents, in a space surrounded by the sounds and smells of the open ocean. She was not healed. She would never be fully healed. But she was there, in a place that was closer to home than she had been since she was a calf. And that was something. That was everything. Marcus framed the photograph and hung it in his new apartment, in a new city, where he had started a new life. He had left the marine park industry. He could not go back. Instead, he worked for an organization that advocated for better conditions for captive marine mammals, using his experience to educate others, to push for change, to prevent other whales from spending their lives pressed against walls. He could not see past. It was difficult work, often frustrating, rarely victorious. But it mattered. He knew it mattered because of her, because of what she had shown him, because of the silence they had shared. Sometimes, late at night, he would look at that photograph and remember. He would remember her eye, her stillness, her fin pressing against the glass. He would remember the weight in his chest that had become part of him, that had shaped him into someone different than he had been before. He would remember that morning when everything began, when he had seen her stop moving and understood, for the first time, what it meant to be trapped in a life you had not chosen. If this story stayed with you, if that silence meant something to you, subscribe to the channel. These stories are not about animals. They are about us. Some memories do not need to be defended. They only need to be remembered.